Night itself was also different. Today, darkness is easy to defeat. We turn on a light. We open a phone. We switch on a lamp. Even outside, streets are illuminated. 300 years ago, artificial light was much limited. Candles and lamps provided light, but they were not as bright as modern electric lighting, and they required fuel. That meant people often organized their activities around daylight. The sun was an important part of the daily schedule. When darkness arrived, many activities slowed down. Of course, people did not simply go to bed the moment the sun disappeared. They talked. They worked on small household tasks. They read when lighting allowed it. They spent time beside fires. They socialized. But nighttime was generally darker and quieter than the modern world.
And then there is another interesting part of historical sleep. People did not necessarily think about sleep in exactly the same way we do. The rhythms of nighttime could vary. People might wake during the night. They might tend to a fire. They might check on children. They might briefly talk with family members and then return to sleep. We should be careful here. There was no single sleeping schedule shared by everyone 300 years ago. People's routines depended on work, family, season, social class, and local customs. Farmers had different schedules from merchants. Servants had different schedules from wealthy householders, and someone working at night had a very different routine from someone who worked during the day. But one thing was common. The night was more dependent on natural darkness than our nights are today.
Morning has arrived, but the room is still cold. The fire that kept the house warm during the evening has burned down during the night. There is no thermostat on the wall. No central heating system is waiting to turn on. No warm air is quietly moving through vents. If you lived 300 years ago, staying warm was something you had to work for. Heat came from fire, and fire required fuel. Wood had to be gathered, purchased, carried, stored, and burned. During winter, this became especially important. The colder the weather became, the more valuable fuel could become. A warm room was not simply a matter of comfort. It depended on resources, and those resources were not unlimited. Imagine having to prepare your home for winter. Before the coldest months arrived, you needed enough fuel. That meant planning ahead. Wood could be collected from nearby areas or purchased from someone who supplied it. Then it had to be transported, and once it reached the house, it needed a dry place to be stored. Every piece of wood represented work. Someone had cut it. Someone had moved it. Someone had carried it. And eventually, someone would place it into the fire. Today, we can heat a home without thinking about the physical process behind it. We press a button, we adjust a temperature, and the machinery does the rest. For people 300 years ago, the process was much more visible. Heat was right there in front of them. A fireplace, a flame, a pile of wood, and the constant responsibility of keeping the fire alive.
Clothing was another important defense against the cold. People wore layers. Wool and other materials could help retain warmth.
Heavy outer garments protected the body when people went outside. Blankets and bedding were important at night. And people adapted their routines to the season. Winter meant shorter days, longer nights, different kinds of work, different foods, and greater attention to keeping warm. For a poor household, winter could be especially challenging. Fuel cost money, warm clothing cost money, and food supplies had to last. A wealthy family might have a larger house, more fuel, servants to maintain fires, and better clothing. A poor family had fewer resources, so winter was not experienced equally by everyone. The same cold weather could be a minor inconvenience for one household and a serious hardship for another.
As evening arrives, the fire becomes even more important. The outside world is dark, the temperature is falling, and inside the house, everyone naturally gathers around the warmth. There is something strangely peaceful about the scene. A family sitting beside a fire, someone preparing food, someone repairing clothing, someone telling a story, a candle flickering on a nearby table. The world outside is cold and dark, but inside the fire provides a small circle of warmth. For people living 300 years ago, this was not a historical scene. It was simply another winter evening. They had no central heating to miss. They had never known it. They knew the fire. They knew the cold. They knew the importance of good blankets, warm clothing, and enough fuel. And they adapted. But staying warm was only one part of the work required to survive an ordinary day. Someone had to prepare the food. Someone had to clean the house. Someone had to collect fuel. Someone had to produce goods. Someone had to work in the fields. And for many people, the working day could be long and physically demanding. So as the fire slowly burns through another piece of wood, let the scene fade. The morning is coming. The streets will become busy again, and ordinary people will return to work.
A fireplace could become the center of household life. People gathered around it. They cooked near it. They worked near it. They talked near it. And during cold weather, they stayed as close to the heat as possible. But a fireplace did not necessarily make the entire house equally warm. The room closest to the fire could be comfortable. Another room could remain chilly. A hallway could be cold. An upstairs bedroom could be colder still. This is one reason why historical homes can feel so different from modern homes. Today, we expect a fairly consistent temperature throughout the building. A bedroom should be warm. A living room should be warm. A bathroom should be warm. But 300 years ago, warmth could be concentrated around the places where fire was available. The house had warm spots, and it had cold spots. People learned where those places were.
The sun is rising. The town is waking up. Doors open one by one. A farmer steps outside. A shopkeeper prepares his store. A craftsman enters his workshop. And somewhere nearby, someone is already carrying water or preparing breakfast. Another working day has begun. For many people 300 years ago, work was not something separated neatly from the rest of life. There was no simple idea of finishing a modern shift and leaving everything behind. Work could begin at home. It could continue in the fields. It could continue in a workshop, and it could return with you at the end of the day. For farmers especially, daily life followed the seasons: planting, growing, harvesting, preparing land, taking care of animals, and preserving what had been produced. The work changed throughout the year, but there was almost always something that needed to be done.
Imagine working in a field without modern machinery. There is no tractor, no powered harvesting machine, no engine doing the hardest part of the work. Much of the labor depends on people and animals. The pace is slower, the work is physical, and weather can change everything. A rainy week could interfere with plans. A dry period could create problems. Harvest time could bring an enormous amount of work that had to be completed within a limited window. For a farming family, the land was not simply a workplace. It was connected to food, income, security, and the future of the family. A successful harvest could bring relief. A poor harvest could create serious difficulties. So agricultural work was not merely having a job. It was closely connected to survival. Imagine working in a field without modern machinery. There is no tractor, no powered harvesting machine, no engine doing the hardest part of the work. Much of the labor depends on people and animals. The pace is slower, the work is physical, and weather can change everything. A rainy week could interfere with plans. A dry period could create problems. Harvest time could bring an enormous amount of work that had to be completed within a limited window. For a farming family, the land was not simply a workplace. It was connected to food, income, security, and the future of the family. A successful harvest could bring relief. A poor harvest could create serious difficulties. So agricultural work was not merely having a job. It was closely connected to survival.
Household work was work too. Cooking, cleaning, washing clothing, preparing food, carrying water, maintaining fires, looking after children. These tasks could take hours. Today, machines have taken over many household jobs. Washing machines clean clothes, dishwashers clean dishes, vacuum cleaners help clean floors, refrigerators preserve food, electric stoves make cooking easier. 300 years ago, many of these tasks required direct human effort, and household labor was often divided according to family roles, social class, age, and local customs. A wealthy household might employ servants to perform many tasks. A poor household might have every member contributing in some way. The house itself could become a workplace.
Eventually, the light begins to disappear. The day's work is coming to an end. A farmer returns from the fields. A shop closes its doors. A craftsman puts away his tools. And families begin preparing for the evening.
But the amount of work people did should not be reduced to one simple number. Working hours varied enormously. Different occupations had different schedules. Seasons changed routines. Some workers had more control over their time than others. And rest days and working patterns differed across communities. Still, one thing is clear. A great deal of everyday work was physical. And many conveniences that modern people consider automatic once required someone's hands. Someone carried the water. Someone chopped the wood. Someone grew the food. Someone repaired the clothes. Someone built the furniture. Someone cleaned the house. The modern world has not eliminated work. But technology has changed how much physical effort many ordinary tasks require. And perhaps nowhere is that difference more interesting than in childhood. Today, childhood is often associated with school, play, hobbies, and learning. 300 years ago, many children were introduced to work much earlier. Their responsibilities could depend heavily on their family and social position. So now, as the evening settles over the old town, let's follow the sound of small footsteps through the doorway. The next part of our journey takes us into the lives of children.
Morning has arrived again. But for many children 300 years ago, childhood did not mean a life completely separated from adult responsibilities. Children still played, they still laughed, they still told stories, they still became curious about the world around them. But depending on their family and circumstances, they could also be expected to help with everyday work from a relatively young age. A child might carry something from one room to another, help prepare food, assist with younger brothers and sisters, feed animals, collect small pieces of firewood, or help a parent with a simple task. These activities were not necessarily seen as unusual. They were simply part of being a member of the household. The idea of childhood has changed enormously over time. And to understand that change, we need to remember that families 300 years ago often depended on every available pair of hands.
For children living in farming families, the seasons could shape their daily lives. During planting and harvesting periods, there was more work to be done. Families needed everyone who was able to contribute. A child might help with simple agricultural tasks appropriate to their age. They could carry small objects, help gather produce, look after animals, or assist an older family member. The exact responsibilities varied greatly. A wealthy child living in a large household could have a completely different upbringing from a child growing up in a farming family. Social class mattered, location mattered, family circumstances mattered, and so did age. A very young child was obviously not expected to do the same work as an older teenager. There was no single childhood experience. There were many different childhoods.
As children grew older, some began learning a trade. This could happen through apprenticeships or by working alongside parents and relatives. A young person might learn to become a tailor, a carpenter, a printer, a baker, a metal worker, or another skilled craftsperson. Learning a profession was not simply about reading instructions. It meant watching, practicing, making mistakes, trying again, and gradually developing skill. An apprentice could spend years learning the details of a trade. For some young people, this offered an important path toward adulthood. They were gaining knowledge that could eventually help them earn a living. But it also meant that the transition from childhood to working life could happen much earlier than many modern people would expect.
As evening arrives, the children return home. The fire is burning. The adults are finishing their work. And the family gathers together. For all the differences between their world and ours, there is something familiar here. Children still wanted attention. They still wanted to play. They still became fascinated by small things. They still learned by watching adults. And they still dreamed about what they might become. The difference was that the path toward adulthood could begin much earlier. Responsibilities arrived sooner for many young people, and the amount of formal education available to them varied enormously.
Of course, children did not spend every moment working. They played, they invented games, they explored their surroundings, they listened to stories, and some had access to education. The amount of education a child received could heavily depend on family wealth, location, gender, and social expectations. Some children learned to read and write. Others received more limited formal education, and many learned practical skills directly from the people around them. A child might learn how to prepare food by watching a parent, how to care for animals by helping with them, how to repair something by observing a craftsman, how to manage a household by participating in daily tasks. Education did not always happen inside a classroom. Sometimes the entire household became the classroom.
The morning begins quietly. A few children enter a small classroom. There are wooden benches, simple desks, ink pots, quill pens, and books that look very different from the colourful textbooks found in modern schools.
Imagine learning to write with a quill. You dip the pen into ink. You carefully form a letter. The ink spreads across the page. You make a mistake, and there is no keyboard waiting for you to press the backspace key. Writing was a physical skill. Students had to learn how to hold the pen, how much pressure to use, how much ink to take, and how to form letters clearly. Paper itself could be valuable, so writing practice was not always as wasteful as it might be today. Books were also much more precious. Printing had already transformed access to written material, but books were still physical objects that required paper, ink, skilled labor, and time to produce. A household with a personal library was not the same as a modern home filled with thousands of digital books. Knowledge had weight. You could hold it in your hands.
The subjects students learned depended on the school and period. Reading and writing could be important. Arithmetic could be useful. Religious instruction played a major role in many educational settings, and children from different backgrounds could receive different kinds of education. For some students, school was only one part of their education. They might learn practical skills at home. A child in a farming family could learn about animals, crops, and seasons. A child in a craft household could learn the basics of a trade. A child in a wealthy family might have access to tutors and more extensive academic instruction. Education was therefore closely connected to social position. The opportunities available to a child could shape the rest of their life.
Classrooms were also more disciplined than many modern classrooms. Teachers were expected to maintain order. Students were expected to listen, and the relationship between teacher and student could be quite formal. But it is important not to turn history into a simple story of cruel teachers and frightened children. Different schools had different rules, different teachers had different personalities, and educational practices changed over time. Some classrooms were strict, others may have been more relaxed. What we can say is that education was shaped by the values of its time. Respect for authority was often important. Memorization could play a major role, and students generally had far fewer learning resources than students have today. There was no quick search for an answer. If you wanted to know something, you needed access to a person or a book that could teach you.
Eventually, the school day comes to an end. The children leave the classroom. Some return home. Others may have chores waiting for them. The teacher closes the door, and the little schoolhouse becomes quiet again. Looking back, it is easy to focus on what these children did not have. No computers, no internet, no modern textbooks, no digital classrooms, but they still learned. They still asked questions. They still made mistakes. They still discovered new ideas. And they still imagined a future beyond the small world they could see around them. The difference was the speed and availability of information. Today, a question can be answered in seconds. 300 years ago, finding an answer might require a teacher, a book, a conversation, or years of experience. And information was not the only thing that moved slowly. People moved slowly too. There were no airplanes, no automobiles, no high-speed trains. Even a journey that seems short on a modern map could take hours or days. So
also leave the schoolhouse behind. The road is waiting outside. A horse is being prepared. The wheels of a wooden carriage are beginning to turn. And our next journey will take us into a world where traveling was itself an exhausting part of everyday life.
The schoolhouse is behind us now. Ahead lies a long road. A horse is waiting. A wooden carriage is ready. And for the travellers inside, the journey is only beginning. Today, travelling a few hundred miles can be surprisingly easy. You can drive on a highway, you can take a train, you can board an aeroplane, and within hours you can cross an enormous distance. 300 years ago, distance had a completely different meaning. A journey that looks short on a modern map could take days. Roads could be rough, weather could slow everything down, and travellers depended on horses, carriages, boats, and their own feet. There was no engine waiting to rescue you from a difficult road. If the horse stopped, the journey stopped. If the road became difficult, you had to slow down. And if the weather turned bad, there was very little you could do about it.
Roads were one of the biggest challenges. Not every road was smooth. Some routes were little more than rough tracks. Rain could turn a road muddy. Snow could make travel difficult. And uneven ground could make a carriage ride extremely uncomfortable. Imagine sitting inside a wooden carriage for hours. There is no modern suspension system, no climate control, no comfortable highway, just wheels moving over the road beneath you. Every bump can be felt. And unlike a modern car, a carriage could not simply maintain a steady speed for hundreds of miles. The horses needed rest. They needed food and water. They could become tired, and the travellers had to plan around them. Travel was therefore not just about the distance between two places. It was about everything required to cover that distance.
Long-distance travellers needed places to stop. Roadside inns became important parts of the journey. A traveller could rest, eat a meal, sleep for the night, and arrange care for the horses. But travel was still expensive. You needed transportation, food, accommodation, and enough time away from your normal responsibilities. For ordinary people, long-distance travel was not necessarily something done casually. A modern person might decide to visit another city simply because they feel like taking a trip. 300 years ago, many journeys had a specific purpose: business, trade, family matters, military service, education, religion, or government work. The journey itself could become a major event.
As the sun begins to set, the travellers are still far from their destination. The road continues ahead. The horses move slowly. The wheels turn. And there are still miles to go. For people 300 years ago, travel required patience. A journey was measured not only in miles, but in hours, meals, overnight stops, weather conditions, and the condition of the road.
Navigation was another challenge. Maps existed. Experienced travelers knew important routes. Guides and local knowledge could help. But there was no smartphone displaying your exact location, no GPS voice telling you to turn left in 200 yards. If you became lost, you had to find someone who knew the area. You might ask another traveler, a local resident, an innkeeper, or someone who regularly used the road. And even when you knew exactly where you were going, the journey could still be uncertain. A broken wheel could cause delays. A sick horse could change the entire plan. Bad weather could force travelers to stop, and unexpected problems were much harder to solve when you were far from home. Distance created uncertainty.
Imagine opening your eyes one morning in the year 1725. For a moment, everything seems quiet. There is no alarm clock beside your bed, no electric light waiting to brighten the room, no refrigerator humming somewhere downstairs, no heating system automatically keeping the house warm, and no phone waiting for you to check the latest messages. Instead, you wake in a room lit by the weak morning light coming through a small window. The floor beneath you is cold, the air is probably colder, and somewhere outside you can already hear the sounds of people beginning another ordinary day. A horse moves along the street. A wooden cart rolls over uneven ground. Someone calls to a neighbor. A door opens. A fire is being prepared. Nothing about this morning feels unusual to the people living here, but to us, almost everything would be strange. 300 years ago, people lived in a world that operated at a completely different rhythm. Life was slower. Work was more physical. Travel was difficult. Information moved slowly, and many of the conveniences we consider essential simply did not exist. Yet people adapted. They worked. They raised children. They fell in love. They argued with their neighbors. They celebrated birthdays and holidays. They worried about money. They complained about the weather. In other words, they lived remarkably ordinary human lives.
The fascinating thing about history is that the past doesn't always look dramatic when you're standing inside it. A person living in 1725 did not wake up every morning thinking, "My life is terribly primitive." They had no reason to think that. This was their normal. If they wanted warm water, they knew how to get it. If they wanted light at night, they knew how to make candles or use lamps. If they wanted to travel, they understood how long the journey might take. If food needed to be preserved, they already knew the methods their families had used for generations. People adapt to the world around them, and that means something that seems shocking to us can become completely ordinary when everyone around us accepts it. That is exactly what we're going to explore. Not kings, not famous battles, not grand palaces, but ordinary life, the little things that people did every single day, the things they rarely questioned. And some of those things were surprisingly uncomfortable.
Think about how many things you use today without even noticing them. You turn on a faucet, water comes out. You switch on a light, the room becomes bright. You open a refrigerator, cold food is waiting inside. You need to speak to someone hundreds of miles away. You send a message. These actions take only seconds. For someone living 300 years ago, many of them would have required planning, physical effort, and patience. Water had to be collected.
Fire had to be maintained, food had to be protected, clothing had to be cleaned by hand. Travel required time, and darkness was a very real part of everyday life. When the sun disappeared, the world became dramatically different. But perhaps the biggest difference was not technology, it was expectation. People expected less because they had never experienced modern convenience. A hard bed was still a bed. A smoky room was still a home. A long journey was simply a journey, and an evening spent sitting quietly beside a fire could be considered a perfectly normal way to end the day.
Of course, life was not equally difficult for everyone. A wealthy family could afford servants. They could purchase better food. They could live in a larger house. They could travel more comfortably. They could pay other people to perform some of the hardest household tasks. For a poor family, life could be very different. Every piece of firewood mattered. Every meal mattered. Every item of clothing mattered. And physical work was part of almost everything. The difference between wealth and poverty was enormous. But even wealthy people could not simply buy their way into the modern world. A rich person could have a beautiful house. They could own expensive furniture. They could have servants. But they still had no electricity, no modern plumbing, no antibiotics, no air conditioning, no instant communication. The entire world had limitations, and those limitations shaped everyone's lives.
So tonight, we're going to step into that world. Slowly, quietly, one ordinary part of life at a time. We'll look at things people 300 years ago considered perfectly normal. Things that might make a modern person uncomfortable. Things that required far more work than they do today. And things that reveal just how dramatically everyday life has changed. We'll begin with something almost everyone today takes for granted: getting clean. Taking a shower, washing your hair, running warm water whenever you want it. It sounds completely ordinary, but 300 years ago, cleanliness could require preparation, physical effort, and time, and the way people thought about bathing was very different from what we know today. So, as the candles burn quietly in the background, let's travel back to the beginning of the 18th century. Leave the modern world behind for a while. Forget the traffic, forget the phones, forget the bright screens, and imagine a world where even something as simple as getting a warm bath could become a surprisingly complicated task. Now imagine that you have just woken up. You are still sitting on the edge of your bed. The room is quiet. There is a small basin nearby. Perhaps a pitcher of water sits beside it. You wash your face. You wash your hands. Maybe you wipe your neck and arms with a cloth. And then you get dressed. For most people living 300 years ago, this could be a completely ordinary morning. There is no shower waiting for you, no bathtub filled with hot water, no convenient faucet, and certainly no endless stream of warm water. Today, turning on a shower is almost effortless. You step inside, you turn a handle, and water begins to fall. If you want warmer water, you adjust another control. If you want colder water, you adjust it again. The entire process can take only a few minutes. In the 18th century, getting enough water for washing was a much bigger task. Someone had to collect it, someone had to carry it, and if you wanted hot water, someone had to heat it. That simple difference changed everyday life. Water had to come from somewhere.
In many communities, wells were important sources of water. A person might walk to the well carrying an empty bucket, lower it, fill it, pull it back up, and then carry the heavy water home. One bucket might not be enough. A household needed water for drinking, for cooking, for cleaning, for washing clothes, and for personal hygiene. Think about how much water a modern household can use without thinking about it. You open a faucet while brushing your teeth. You wash dishes under running water. You fill a glass. You take a shower. You flush a toilet. All of that depends on an enormous system working quietly in the background. 300 years ago, there was no such system in the way we know it today. Water was something physical. You could feel its weight. You had to move it. And because of that, people naturally became careful about how they used it.
This is where it is important to avoid one common misunderstanding. People 300 years ago were not simply walking around without washing themselves. That idea is far too simplistic. People used basins. They washed their hands and faces. They cleaned parts of their bodies. They changed clothing. They washed linen garments. And bathing habits varied enormously depending on time, place, wealth, and personal preference. Clean clothing could be especially important. A person might have a heavy outer coat that was difficult to wash, but the lighter clothing worn underneath could be changed or cleaned more easily. So cleanliness was not necessarily measured by the number of showers someone took. People had different ideas about what it meant to be clean, and those ideas were shaped by the technology available to them. When water is difficult to obtain, heat, and carry, everyday habits naturally change.
There was another important difference. Modern people often think of hygiene as something private. You have your bathroom, your shower, your sink, your towels. Everything is designed around convenience. 300 years ago, many of these activities required shared household space. Water had to be carried through the home. Fire had to be maintained. Large containers had to be moved, and washing could become part of the rhythm of household work. It is easy to imagine that people in the past simply accepted discomfort, but that is not quite right. People enjoyed comfort just as much as we do. They appreciated warm water. They appreciated clean clothes. They appreciated a comfortable bed. They simply had to work harder to obtain those things. And that is one of the biggest themes of our journey through the past. Modern life has not completely changed what people want. It has changed how much effort is required to get it. But water was not the only problem. Once you walk outside the house and enter a crowded 18th century town, another part of everyday life becomes impossible to ignore. The streets themselves could be dirty. Animals moved through them, waste accumulated, and sanitation was a constant challenge.
Now add another problem. Suppose you want warm water. First, you need a container. Then you need water. Then you need fuel. Wood must be gathered or purchased. A fire must be started. The fire must be watched. And finally, the water begins to warm. None of this is particularly complicated, but it takes time. A warm bath was therefore not simply a matter of deciding that you wanted one. It could become a small household project. In wealthier homes, servants could handle much of this work. They could carry water, heat it, prepare a tub, and clean everything afterward. For poorer households, the work fell on family members themselves. That meant bathing could be less frequent and more practical. People still washed, people still cared about cleanliness, but the routine was different.
Step outside your home in the early 18th century, and one of the first things you might notice is something you cannot see: the smell. It would be difficult for a modern person to imagine just how different the atmosphere of an old European town could feel. There were horses in the streets, there were animals in courtyards, there were open markets, there were fireplaces producing smoke, there were food stalls preparing meals, and there was waste. Today, most cities have enormous systems designed to move waste away from where people live. Garbage is collected, sewage is transported through underground pipes, streets are regularly cleaned, water is treated, and countless workers maintain systems that most people rarely think about. 300 years ago, many of those systems were either much less developed or simply did not exist. The result was a city that smelled very different from the cities we know today.
Consider the horse. For centuries, horses were essential to transportation. They carried people, they pulled carts, they moved goods. They were part of everyday life. But every horse also produced waste. And when many horses were concentrated in a busy town, that became a very noticeable part of the environment. Add livestock, add food scraps, add mud, add smoke, add crowded buildings, and you begin to understand why the smell of a historical city could be so distinctive. People living there were accustomed to it. They had grown up with those smells. Their parents had experienced the same environment. Their grandparents had experienced it too. So what seems shocking to us could simply disappear into the background of everyday life. Rain could make things even more complicated. Water moved along streets and carried dirt from one place to another. In some towns, drainage systems existed, but they were far less sophisticated than modern systems. Keeping streets clean was an ongoing challenge, and cleanliness was not only a matter of personal hygiene, it was also a problem for the entire community. Imagine living above a shop on a narrow street. Outside your window, people are constantly passing. A cart rolls by. A horse walks past. A merchant calls out to customers. Children run through the street. Someone is carrying a basket of food. Someone else is carrying water. The street is alive from morning until evening. But with all that activity came noise, dust, smoke, mud, and unpleasant smells. There was no way to completely escape them. Yet perhaps the most interesting thing is that people did not spend their days complaining about the smell. At least, not constantly. People complained about many things: the weather, taxes, neighbors, prices, work, politics. But the general smell of the city was simply part of life. This is something we often forget when we imagine the past. History is not just about inventions and famous events. It is also about the background conditions people learned to accept. The temperature of a room, the amount of light at night, the time required to travel, the effort required to wash clothes, and even the smell of the street outside the front door. For someone living in 1725, this was normal. For us, it would probably be one of the first things we noticed. And once we have walked through those streets, there is another everyday problem waiting for us, something even more private, something every person has to deal with: the bathroom, or rather, the lack of the modern bathroom. Markets were another source of powerful smells. Fresh bread could smell wonderful. Roasting food could smell delicious. Spices could fill the air, but a busy market was not always pleasant. Food was being prepared outdoors. Animals were nearby. Fish, meat, vegetables, fruit, herbs and grains were all being sold in close quarters. And remember, refrigeration did not exist. Food had to be consumed, preserved, salted, dried, smoked, or otherwise protected using the methods available at the time. That meant people had to think carefully about food. They could not simply place leftovers inside a refrigerator and forget about them. The kitchen was a place of constant activity, and the smells of cooking became a permanent part of household life.
There is one part of everyday life that modern people rarely think about: going to the bathroom. Today, the process is so familiar that we hardly notice how complicated the system behind it really is. You enter a private bathroom. You close the door. You use a toilet. You flush. And within seconds, everything disappears from your sight. 300 years ago, that simple process looked very different. There were no modern toilets connected to underground sewage networks, no flushing system like the one we use today, and no enormous network of pipes quietly carrying waste away from every home. Instead, people relied on much simpler methods. One common solution inside homes was the chamber pot. It was exactly what it sounds like, a container kept inside the house for private use. At night especially, it was far more convenient than going outside.
Imagine waking up in the middle of a cold night. It is completely dark outside. There is no electric light. Your bedroom is cold, and the nearest convenient toilet may not be inside the house at all. For many people, a chamber pot solved part of the problem. It could be kept near the bed or in a private part of the room. Afterward, however, the container had to be emptied and cleaned, and that task had to be done regularly. Someone had to carry it away. Someone had to dispose of its contents appropriately. Someone had to wash the container. Today, we press a handle and never see what happens next. The infrastructure is hidden underground. In the past, much more of the process was visible. That meant sanitation was not an invisible service. It was a household responsibility. And in crowded towns, managing waste was a serious challenge.
Public facilities existed in various forms, and people had different levels of privacy depending on where they lived and how much money they had. Privacy itself was not always as easy to achieve as it is today. Modern bathrooms are designed around the idea that everyone should have a private space, a door, a lock, running water, lighting, a clean surface, and a reliable system underneath the floor. 300 years ago, privacy depended much more on the building, the household, and the resources available. For someone living in a large house, there could be more options. For someone living in a small, crowded home, privacy could be limited. And for travelers, soldiers, workers, and people living in temporary conditions, bathroom arrangements could be even more basic. What we now consider a basic household feature was once a luxury of infrastructure.
Outside the home, different communities developed different ways of dealing with waste. Some places had drainage channels, some had designated collection areas, some relied on workers to remove waste, and practices varied greatly from one city to another. It is important not to imagine that every 18th century town was exactly the same. History is full of differences. A wealthy neighborhood could look very different from a poor neighborhood. A large city could have different sanitation practices from a small village, and conditions changed over time. But compared with modern cities, waste management was generally far less convenient. The modern idea of every home being connected to a reliable sewage system was still far in the future. That difference becomes especially interesting when we remember how many people could live close together. A crowded city creates a simple problem. The more people there are, the more waste there is, and if there is no efficient system for removing it, the entire community has to deal with the consequences.
This is one of those historical details that seems almost too ordinary to matter, but it tells us something important. The modern world is built on systems we rarely see. Water comes in, waste goes out, electricity arrives, trash disappears, food stays cold, and because these systems work quietly, we often forget how much effort they save us. 300 years ago, many of those tasks were much closer to everyday life. People had to think about water, they had to think about waste, they had to think about cleanliness, and they had to manage these things with the tools available to them. It wasn't necessarily something people thought about every minute, it was simply another part of living. And then there was an even bigger problem. What happened when the human body became sick? Today we have hospitals, trained specialists, modern diagnostic equipment, and medicines that can treat diseases that were once extremely dangerous. But 300 years ago, medical care looked very different. A fever could create uncertainty, a wound could become a serious concern, and a doctor could offer little more than the knowledge available at the time. So now, quietly leave the old bathroom behind, walk down the candlelit hallway, open the wooden door, and enter the world of 18th century medicine. A doctor could be intelligent, careful, and genuinely concerned about a patient, and still be unable to cure a serious illness. That is perhaps one of the hardest things for a modern person to imagine. Today, we are used to the idea that medicine can often identify a disease and offer a specific treatment. But 300 years ago, uncertainty was much greater. A fever could have many possible causes. An infection could be difficult to understand. A persistent cough might remain a mystery. A serious injury could become dangerous. And without modern testing, doctors had to depend heavily on observation. They looked at the patient, they listened, they asked questions, they examined physical signs, and then they made their best judgment. Sometimes that judgment helped. Sometimes it did not, and sometimes there was simply nothing effective that could be done.
Medicine in the 18th century was a mixture of observation, tradition, experience, and theories about how the human body worked. Physicians studied symptoms, they examined patients, they read medical books, they discussed cases with other doctors, and they tried to make sense of illnesses that could behave in mysterious ways. An apothecary might prepare medicines from plants, minerals, and other substances. Some treatments had genuine benefits, others were less useful, and some ideas that seemed reasonable at the time would later be abandoned as medical science advanced. This is an important part of understanding history. It is easy to look backward and say, how could anyone believe that? But the people living in the 18th century did not have the information we have today. They were working with the evidence available to them. Their world was not a world without science. It was a world where science was still developing.
Illness was therefore much more familiar in everyday life. Families watched children become sick. Parents worried about their sons and daughters. Adults cared for elderly relatives, and communities regularly experienced diseases that modern people may encounter far less often. The emotional experience was not so different from today. People worried, people hoped, people prayed, people searched for answers, and people tried to comfort one another. The difference was the amount of uncertainty surrounding the illness. A family might not know exactly what was happening. They might not know how long it would last, and they might not know whether the patient would recover. That uncertainty could make an ordinary illness feel frightening, but it was also something people learned to live with. They developed traditions. They followed advice from family members. They listened to local healers and medical practitioners, and they passed knowledge from one generation to the next.
Now imagine that you wake up one morning feeling seriously ill. Your body feels weak, you have a fever, you cannot concentrate, and you know something is wrong. Today, many people would know what to do next. You might tell your family, you might call a doctor, you might visit a clinic, perhaps you would take medicine and rest, and if the illness became serious, you could go to a hospital. 300 years ago, the situation could be very different. A doctor might still be available. There were physicians, there were surgeons, there were apothecaries, there were people who spent their lives studying medicine. But their knowledge had limits. Many diseases were poorly understood. Doctors did not yet have the modern understanding of microorganisms that would later transform medicine. They had no antibiotics, no modern diagnostic machines, no modern intensive care, and no guarantee that treatment would work. Sometimes the greatest problem was not the lack of effort, it was the lack of knowledge.
The 18th century was also a time of medical change. New ideas were emerging. People were observing the human body more carefully. Medical education was developing. Anatomical knowledge was improving, and physicians were gradually building a larger body of evidence.
There are few pains as familiar as a toothache. A small problem inside your mouth can suddenly become impossible to ignore. Today, when a tooth begins to hurt, many people know exactly where to go. The dentist. You make an appointment. You sit in a modern chair. The dentist examines the tooth. Perhaps an X-ray is taken. And then, depending on the problem, there may be several ways to treat it. 300 years ago, dental care was far less predictable. There were people who practiced dentistry. There were surgeons and medical practitioners who dealt with problems involving teeth. But modern dentistry did not yet exist in the form we recognize today. There were no modern dental clinics, no electric drills, no modern imaging, and no advanced anesthetic techniques that made routine dental treatment much easier to tolerate. For someone with a serious tooth problem, the options could be limited.
The biggest problem was often not simply the procedure, it was pain. Modern dentistry has many ways to control discomfort. That has completely changed the experience of visiting a dentist. In the 18th century, pain management was much more limited. This meant that people could have very different attitudes toward dental treatment.
A minor tooth problem might be ignored for as long as possible. Someone might try a home remedy. They might ask a family member for advice. They might visit an apothecary or practitioner. And sometimes, when the problem became serious, the available treatment could be unpleasant. It is easy for us to imagine that people in the past were somehow tougher, but there is no reason to think that human beings 300 years ago felt pain differently. A painful tooth hurt then, just as it hurts now. The difference was what people could do about it.
And this is another pattern we keep seeing as we travel through the 18th century. The problem is not always that people didn't understand discomfort. They understood it very well. The problem was that technology had not yet caught up with human needs. People wanted clean teeth. They wanted relief from pain. They wanted their families to stay healthy. They wanted comfortable homes. They wanted food to remain fresh. They wanted to travel quickly. The desires were surprisingly familiar. The tools were not. That is why history can feel strange. The people of the past were not living with completely different human emotions. They were living with different possibilities.
Today, a visit to the dentist may be inconvenient. You may not enjoy sitting in the chair. You may worry about the cost. You may simply wish you were somewhere else. But imagine knowing that the technology available to your dentist was extremely limited. Imagine having a painful tooth and knowing that the solutions were not nearly as advanced as they are today. Suddenly, the modern dental office begins to look like a remarkable piece of technology, not because everything is perfect, but because centuries of observation, experimentation, and scientific progress have transformed something as simple as treating a tooth. And now, let's leave the quiet medical room behind, because even when people were healthy, they faced another problem every single day: food. Today, we open a refrigerator and expect our food to stay cold. We can buy milk, meat, fruit, vegetables, and countless other foods and store them safely for days. But 300 years ago, there was no refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. Keeping food fresh required knowledge, preparation, and often a great deal of work. So let's step into an 18th century kitchen and discover what happened to food before refrigeration changed everything.
One of the most interesting parts of early dental history is that dentistry was not always a completely separate profession. In parts of Europe, barber surgeons performed various procedures. Barbers already worked closely with people using sharp instruments. Over time, some practitioners also became involved in surgical procedures, including dental work. This tells us something important about how different the medical world was. Today, we are surrounded by specialized professions. You have a dentist, a surgeon, a pharmacist, a nurse, a dental hygienist, and many other specialists. 300 years ago, those boundaries were not always as clearly defined. People often learned practical skills through apprenticeships and experience. Their training could vary considerably, and the quality of care depended heavily on the individual practitioner and the place where you lived.
Walk into an ordinary kitchen 300 years ago, and one thing immediately becomes clear. There is no refrigerator, no freezer, no electric cooling system quietly protecting yesterday's leftovers. Today, refrigeration is so normal that we barely notice it. We buy food from a supermarket, we bring it home, we place it inside a refrigerator, and then we expect much of it to remain usable for days. If something needs to stay frozen, we put it in the freezer. The machine does the work for us. But in the 18th century, keeping food fresh was a daily challenge. People still needed to eat. They still had leftovers. They still had meat, milk, vegetables, fruit, bread, and other foods that could spoil.
One of the oldest methods of preserving food was salting. Salt could help preserve certain foods for longer periods. People also dried foods. They smoked them. They pickled them. They stored some foods in cool places, and they used containers designed to protect food from air, moisture, insects, and other problems. These techniques required planning. If a family knew that winter was approaching, they could not simply assume that a supermarket would continue providing everything they needed. They had to think ahead. Food preservation was part of survival. It was part of household knowledge, and it could take considerable time. Imagine preparing food for a family without a refrigerator. You cannot simply cook a large meal and put the leftovers into a cold appliance. You have to consider what will happen to the food afterward. Will it be eaten soon? Should it be preserved? Should it be dried? Should it be salted? Should it be stored somewhere cooler? Every meal existed within a larger system of planning.
Shopping for food was different too. Today, many people can buy food whenever they need it. You can visit a grocery store in the evening. You can buy food for several days. And if you forget something, you can simply return tomorrow. 300 years ago, shopping habits depended much more on location, season, availability, and household resources. Markets were important, local producers were important, and seasonal food mattered. Some foods were available only at certain times of the year. Others could be stored for longer. This meant that people had to understand the rhythm of the seasons. They knew when certain crops were harvested. They knew which foods could be stored. They knew which foods needed to be eaten quickly. And they learned these things because their daily lives depended on them. Knowledge that might seem simple today could once be extremely valuable.
Now imagine the arrival of winter. The fields are quiet. Fresh produce may be harder to obtain. The weather makes travel more difficult, and the household begins depending on food that was preserved earlier. This is why food storage was so important. A well-prepared household could rely on supplies that had been gathered and preserved during better seasons. Different foods required different methods. Some were dried, some were salted, some were fermented, some were stored in cool cellars, and some were simply eaten before they had a chance to spoil. There was no single method that worked for everything. People learned through experience. They watched their parents. They followed traditions, and they passed those techniques from one generation to the next. The kitchen was not simply a place where food was cooked. It was also a place where knowledge was preserved. And this brings us to something important. People in the past did not necessarily think about their food as inferior. They had their own tastes, their own recipes, their own favorite meals, their own traditions. What seems strange to us could be completely familiar to them. A meal prepared with preserved ingredients was simply dinner. Bread was not something you picked up from a supermarket shelf. It was connected to the work of farmers, millers, bakers, and households. Food was connected to seasons, to weather, to geography, and to the amount of labor available. Today, refrigeration has removed much of that uncertainty from our daily lives. We can keep food cold, we can freeze it, we can store it for much longer. And because the process is so easy, we rarely think about how revolutionary it really is. But food was not only about keeping it fresh, there was another question. What did ordinary people actually eat? What appeared on their tables? What foods were common? And how different was the daily meal of an ordinary person from the meal we might expect from a wealthy household? Let's step into the dining room. The table is ready, the candles are burning, and dinner is about to begin. The candles are burning. The room is warm from the fire, and dinner is finally ready. If you could sit at this table 300 years ago, you might recognize some of the food: bread, vegetables, grain, soup, stew, perhaps cheese, perhaps eggs, and depending where you lived, perhaps some meat. At first, this might not seem very different from food we eat today, but the biggest difference was not necessarily what people ate, it was what determined what they could eat. Today, food can travel enormous distances before it reaches your kitchen. A fruit grown in one country can appear in a supermarket thousands of miles away. A person living in a cold region can buy foods that would never naturally grow there, and almost every season can offer an enormous variety. 300 years ago, the situation was much more connected to geography and season. Where you lived mattered, what grew nearby mattered, and what your family could afford mattered. For ordinary families, grains were extremely important. Bread and other grain-based foods could provide a major part of the diet. Different regions depended on different crops. Wheat was important in many places. Other grains were also widely used, depending on local conditions. Vegetables could be grown in gardens or obtained from local markets. Legumes could provide an important source of nourishment, and preserved foods helped families through periods when fresh ingredients were harder to obtain. The daily meal was often practical. It needed to provide enough food for people who were doing physical work. A farmer who spent hours working outdoors needed energy. A laborer needed a filling meal. A household could not afford to waste much food, and because food required labor to produce, prepare, and preserve, throwing it away could be a serious matter.
One thing that connected many households was the importance of simple cooking. A large pot could become the center of a meal. Ingredients could be combined into a soup or stew. Food could be cooked slowly over a fire. Bread could accompany the meal, and leftovers could sometimes become part of another dish. This kind of cooking made sense in a world where fuel, ingredients, and time all mattered. A household did not necessarily have a kitchen filled with dozens of specialized appliances. Instead, there might be a fireplace, pots, pans, knives, wooden utensils, and a collection of ingredients.
The cook had to understand the fire. There was no electric oven giving a perfectly controlled temperature. No microwave fan for reheating food in seconds. No digital timer announcing the dinner was ready. Cooking depended on experience. You watched the fire, you watched the food, and you learned how long things needed to cook.
And perhaps the most important difference was variety. Modern supermarkets have changed our expectations about food. We expect choices, different fruits, different vegetables, different breads, different meats, different snacks, different cuisines from around the world. For many people 300 years ago, the daily menu was much more predictable. That did not necessarily make meals meaningless, quite the opposite. Food was deeply connected to family traditions, celebrations, religion, seasons, and community. A special meal could feel genuinely special because it was different from an ordinary meal. A holiday could bring foods that were rarely eaten on normal days. A successful harvest could change what appeared on the table, and a wealthy guest might be served foods that demonstrated the household's status. So when we imagine the dining table of 1725, we should not imagine a world without enjoyable food. We should imagine a world where food required more planning, more labor, more preservation, and more awareness of the seasons. But after dinner came another part of everyday life that modern people rarely think about: going to sleep. Today, we expect a bedroom to be comfortable. We expect a mattress. We expect blankets. We expect artificial light, and many people expect a quiet room. 300 years ago, the experience of going to bed could be very different. The bedroom was colder. The lighting was weaker. The bed itself could be surprisingly unfamiliar, and even the way people thought about nighttime was different. So, as the candles slowly disappear and the household becomes quiet, let's walk upstairs. The day is ending, the streets are getting darker, and it is time to sleep.
Meat was another food whose availability depended heavily on wealth and location. For some households, meat appeared regularly. For others, it was less common. The diet of a wealthy family could be considerably more varied than the diet of a poor household. This difference is important. When we imagine people living 300 years ago, we sometimes imagine a single historical diet. But there was no such thing. A wealthy household in a major city could have access to foods that an ordinary rural family could rarely afford. A coastal community might eat more fish. A farming community might depend heavily on grains and vegetables. A household with livestock might have access to milk, eggs, or meat. Geography created different diets. Money created different diets. And tradition created different diets. Night itself was also different. Today, darkness is easy to defeat. We turn on a light. We open a phone. We switch on a lamp. Even outside, streets are illuminated. 300 years ago, artificial light was much limited. Candles and lamps provided light, but they were not as bright as modern electric lighting, and they required fuel. That meant people often organized their activities around daylight. The sun was an important part of the daily schedule. When darkness arrived, many activities slowed down. Of course, people did not simply go to bed the moment the sun disappeared. They talked. They worked on small household tasks. They read when lighting allowed it. They spent time beside fires. They socialized. But nighttime was generally darker and quieter than the modern world. The house has become quiet. Dinner is over. The dishes have been put away. The fire is slowly becoming smaller, and one by one the candles are going out. It is time to sleep. For a modern person, bedtime usually means entering a bedroom designed specifically for comfort. There may be a soft mattress, pillows, warm blankets, electric lights, heating or air conditioning, perhaps even a fan making a gentle sound in the background. 300 years ago, a bedroom could feel very different. The room might be cold, the windows could allow drafts, the bed might be made from materials very different from the mattresses we know today. And once the candle was extinguished, the room became almost completely dark. Yet people slept, they adapted, and nighttime had its own rhythm.
Beds varied enormously depending on wealth and location. A wealthy household could have a large, carefully made bed. Some beds were surrounded by curtains. These curtains were not simply decorative. They could provide privacy. They could help create a more enclosed sleeping space, and they could offer some protection from cold air. For poorer households, sleeping arrangements could be much simpler. Several members of a family might share a room. In some homes, people slept on mattresses made from natural materials. The quality of bedding depended heavily on what the household could afford. This is another reminder that there was never one universal experience of the past. A wealthy person's bedroom and a poor worker's sleeping space could feel like completely different worlds. Both people lived in the same century, but their experience of that century was not the same.